This is your cellular transport notes. Remember, you can stop me, pause me, or rewind me as often as much as you need to learn and fill in your directed reading packet and cellular transport.
So move it, I like to move it, you like to move it.
Just like the song is going, I like to move it. That is the whole purpose of the plasma membrane during cellular transport, to allow certain substances or particles into or out to ensure homeostasis, which is balance of the cell. Again, the goal of cellular transport is to move substances in and out of the cell to maintain balance, aka homeostasis. You can think of it kind of like a gatekeeper, them regulating materials into or out, which prevents the cell from becoming too toxic. Let's review a little bit. The plasma membrane is made up of two layers of phospholipids, thus calling the membrane selectively permeable. There are two parts to the phospholipid bilayer. One are little round balls that are orange, and those are called the head, and it is polar, which means that it attracts water. The other are the little stringy guys hanging down. Those are the tails, and are nonpolar, which repels water. As a result, it creates a barrier, which is polar on the outside and nonpolar on the inside. This separation allows the outside environment to be different from the inside environment. This allows particles to move accordingly how they need to or want to. Your drawing of the plasma membrane. If you were to draw it, it should look something like this. You should have a bunch of little balls on the top and on the bottom, and a little strings hanging on in the inside. Again, those little balls are the heads, which are polar, and then you have your tails, which are nonpolar, and then the carrier proteins embedded throughout your membrane. There are two types of transport. One is passive transport, and the other is active transport. We will learn three kinds of each. For passive transport, the first is diffusion, osmosis, and then the last is facilitated diffusion. A couple of things to remember about passive. No energy is needed since it goes with the gradient, meaning substances move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. You can kind of think of it like riding your bike down a hill. When you ride down that hill, you coast, meaning you don't use any kind of energy. Plus, you're moving from a high area to a very low area, which would be the bottom of the hill. The second type is active transport, but we will come back to it. Let's learn about passive first. Again, remember, no energy is needed. It moves with the gradient, and this is very important for the travel of certain gases, sugars, and water. So the first type of transport is diffusion. It is the net movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, or an area of many particles to an area of very few particles. Two definitions that we got to remember. Concentration, that's the amount or quantity of a substance. And then the other one you're going to hear me talk about is equilibrium. That is when there can be a continuous movement, but no change within that solution. Some things that can affect diffusion: concentration, temperature, pressure, the size of the particles, and the charge of the particles. Let's watch that video here to see diffusion in action. So as you can see, that sugar cube was dropped into that beaker of water, and over time all those little sugar molecules are being spread out until eventually they will become completely even or at equilibrium in that beaker. Again, there's no energy being used, and this is diffusion. Some examples of diffusion you can think about. How many times have you been upstairs or somewhere other than in the kitchen and you can smell Mom baking cookies? Again, that's diffusion. If you put any kind of dye in water, like at Easter time, at first, that little, the dye piece is very, very concentrated, goes in the water. Eventually, over time, it will reach equilibrium, allowing that water to be the color that you need for your Easter egg. But the most important is for your oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange when you breathe. The second type is facilitated diffusion. Kind of a big word, but it's very, very similar to what we just talked about. This is when there are too large of molecules to cross the membrane, so all they have to do is they have to use a transport protein. So what's going to happen? That transport protein, or that channel protein, will open up, allow the substance to come in, and then it just goes right through it. It diffuses right to the inside of the membrane. Again, no energy is needed. Let's watch the video. So as you can see, there are a lot of molecules on the outside. That little purple thing is the carrier protein, and there's not very many particles on the inside. So again, we're moving from a high concentration to an area of low concentration. That little particle just attached to the carrier protein. The carrier protein will allow it to come inside the cell. No energy, again, is needed. And the best example for this is sugar. The last type of passive transport is what we call osmosis. Osmosis is the diffusion of water across the selectively permeable membrane. It is only talking about water, no other type of substance. Obviously, this maintains homeostasis because you need water in your body to keep you hydrated. And a couple of things we got to remember. Solvent versus solute. Solvent is always going to be talking about water, and solute is whatever other substance you're talking about. Salt, sugar, or some kind of other substance in your cell. There are three types: hypotonic, hypertonic, and isotonic solution. We will be looking at what happens in a plant and animal cells during osmosis. The first type is isotonic solution. This is when a solution has the same concentration of solutes on the outside as it does on the inside. Iso means equal, so that sort of makes sense. Same on the inside, same on the outside. Because of this, water is able to move in and out of the cell at the same rate, and the cell will keep or retain its normal shape. It's not going to blow up, and it won't shrink. It just keeps its normal shape. In an animal cell, this is perfect because you're at equilibrium. This is what we always want to be at, in some kind of isotonic or equal state. In plant cells, it's not the perfect condition, but it's still pretty good. As you can see in the picture on the left, we have a cell that has 10% solute, and then the solution it's in is also 10%. So both are equal. Water can go in both directions. Same with the plant cell. It is also demonstrating an isotonic solution, where water can move in and out freely, and there's no change to that plant cell. The next type is what we call hypotonic solution. This is where a solution has a lower concentration of solute outside than it does inside the cell. So water outside is greater than water on the inside. So if you have too much water, you're hypo, because you're not very solute. You don't have very much solute in you, so you're hypo. Again, hypo means under. The water is going to move in the cell, and sometimes it can even get so bad that it might even burst the cell, which obviously is not a good thing, especially if you're an animal cell, because if you burst you die. That's it. In a plant cell, however, this is the perfect condition that it wants to be. So as we look at the diagram here of that hypotonic solution, the environment has a very low solute, only 10% level, but has a much higher water level at 90%, compared to the cell itself, which has a solute level of 20% and a lower water level than the outside at 80%. Because of this, water is going to try to rush in to try to dilute all that solute that's in the cell. Again, this can obviously be really bad for an animal because it could burst or destroy the cell. But in a plant, this is really good because the vacuum is going to get filled up. It will push against the cell membrane and the cell wall, making the plant what we call turgid, or as upright as possible as it can. So it's a very nice and healthy plant. The last type is what we call a hypertonic solution. This is a solution that has a higher concentration of solute outside than it does on the inside. Hyper means above, so again it makes sense. More solute. Water then is less than water on the inside. So as a result, water will move out of the cell, and because of this, the cell can shrink or, completely shrivel up. Okay. As you can see in the diagrams, the environment has a very high solute, about 20% salt, which then leaves 80% solvent or water. The inside of the cell is 10% salt, which is lower, but does have a higher solvent or water level, 90%, than does the other side. Thus, water is going to rush out of the cell to dilute the environment to become more equal or to try to reach equilibrium. This causes the cell to shrink or to shrivel up. Obviously, this is not good for us as animal cells because that means you are completely dehydrated. Now, it's also not good for a plant cell because they then will wilt, or if it gets too hypertonic, could actually die because they have no water. Alright, so let's do some of our essential questions. List the three main types of passive transport. What happens in a hypotonic cell, an isotonic cell, and in a hypertonic cell? What's the difference between diffusion and facilitated diffusion? And a couple of vocabulary words. Homeostasis, diffusion, dynamic equilibrium, facilitated diffusion, osmosis, hypertonic, hypotonic, and isotonic.
Put your body out in the big Titanic, woman in nice, sweet, fantastic. Put your body out in the big Titanic, woman in nice, sweet, fantastic. Put your body out in the big Titanic, woman. I like to move it, move it. I like to
Don't forget,